In today's module, we're going to be talking about organization policies, right? So, this is part of the Google Cloud Certified Cloud Engineer Security Pacific track. And if you think about this, this is more like a level 100 course, right? And really, the kind of like the focus of organization policies and to keep in the back of your mind is a way of implementing guardrails, right? So, before we kind of get started in this module, let's just do a quick recap on the resource hierarchy. And this is important because when we're applying organization policies, it all evolves around this resource hierarchy. So at the top, you have the company, then you have your folders, then you have your projects, and then you have your resources. And this is a new concept if you're coming from, say, Azure or AWS, right? But just keep in mind that I'm not going to go into detail here explaining the whole organization, the resource hierarchy, and all that kind of good stuff, right? But just keep in mind that this is something you do need to know as a prerequisite for this specific module, right? So, first of all, what are organization policies, right? And really, at the basic level, is a way or ability having control over your cloud resources, right? And what do we mean by control, right? So, control can be centralized, it can be programmatic, and if we look at just the word control, organization policy, basically all that equates to is constraints, right? And what we're doing here is introducing the concept of constraints, and it's in itself, it's a way of creating fine-grained control over those resources, right? And really what we're focusing on in this module and with organization policies is the what aspects, right? What can be done on the cloud resource, right? And when we think about what can be done, things like configuration, right? Deployment, right? Those are the kind of things that can be done on a specific resource, right? And the whole aspects of constraints is setting basically restrictions, right? What you can do, what you can't do, etc., right? So if we compare organization policies with identity access management, IAM, you could kind of like think, are they the same, are they different? And in actual fact, there is a big difference between the two, right? And in the previous slide, we talked about the what, right? So organization policy focuses on what, but identity access management focuses on who can do something on the resource, right? As opposed to what can be done on the resource, right? And again, when we're looking at identity access management, we're kind of like thinking here around permissions, right? So we're working with permissions and the ability to give permissions on various different aspects, and that's what identity access management is, right? Now, the question here is, why use organization policies, right? And more importantly, what are some of the benefits of that, right? So there are a number of key benefits. The first main benefit is, as we discussed before, is the ability to restrict on how that resource can be used, right? Again, kind of going back to that concept of guardrails, right? And an approach to implementing the guardrails is really the who. Like, so for example, we may want to set some constraints, organization policies for the development teams, right? Guardrails, right? What can the development teams do, right? And another reason, approach that we can do is why, right? So, meet compliance, regulatory compliance, and we can set constraints, organization policies to enforce, to make sure that resources are, when they're deployed or configured, comply to the company's requirements, right? Those security requirements, right? And another way of organization policies is the ability to make an organization more fluid, right? The ability to move fast without breaking the compliance. So, for example, if they want to configure something, deploy something, they don't have to seek permissions. We can automatically put the organization policies that prevents them from going outside of essentially the controlled tracks, so as to speak, right? So let's look at some examples of organization policies, right? So the most common use case of organization policies is, as we discussed, is introducing constraints, right? So what do we mean by that, right? So we can limit something, right? So for example, we can limit the ability to share something, right? So that could be categorized as limit sharing, right? Another constraint could be limiting its usage, right? So for example, limiting how a feature or functionality is used, setting some boundaries there and some restrictions on that aspect, right? And then we can also look at organization policies around limiting the deployment, right? where the resource is deployed, such as the region. So for example, if you're looking at compliance and you want to deploy something outside of the EU region, right? So something like GDPR may be an important aspect of the organization, or the California Privacy Act or something like that. And then you can control organization policies to control where that resource is deployed to make sure it's compliant to Pacific standard, right? When we look at organization policy constraints, right, the actual restrictions, and we dive a little bit deeper, there are a lot of constraints, right? But the most important thing here that I want to highlight at this stage is um, constraints really fall into two buckets, essentially, right? You have Google Cloud defined service constraints, right? So this is a list of constraints that Google comes up with Google Cloud. Okay, and I put a link here in the slide that provides all these different links, so all these different constraints that you can simply use, right? For most people that kind of works. For other organizations, you may want to create your own constraints, or you may want to use a blend of the two, right? If we look at organization policies, it is created by the organization policy administrator. That is the role within Google Cloud. And if you look at the organization policy, it can be set, if you think in terms of applying restrictions on, it can be set at the organization level, at the folder level, and at the project level. Again, going back to that prerequisite slide, that resource hierarchy, you can actually place it, you can apply that policy at different levels. Now, where you apply the policy is very, very important, right? And we'll come back to that in a minute. We will revisit that topic in a minute, right? But again, continuing the concept of constraints, right? It can be at any a very specific or individual restriction, right? Or it could be a way of specifying an organization policy. So if you think of that hierarchy, right, you can make it very broad, so it can be at the top, right, at the organization level, and or you can make it very specific, where it's more perhaps at the project level or at the resource level, right? Typically, in a real world kind of scenario, you'll typically have a number of constraints as opposed to a singular constraint. But you could, in theory, but most often the practice is that you'll have multiple constraints, right? So, as I mentioned before, Google has their own predefined list, and these are essentially GCP defined restrictions, right? And again, when we look at these constraints, they're applied against a specific GCP service or a collection of GCP service, right? So just keep that in mind, that you do have those two options, right? And something I just alluded to on the previous slide is you can create your own custom constraints, right? Your own restrictions, so to speak. And again, the same concepts apply, right? So are you applying those to a single specific GCP resource or a collection of GCP resources, right? And really kind of like think of constraints as the blueprints as to what you want to do, right? So it's kind of controlling, defining that behavior, using blueprints to define that constraint, right? And when we think of what makes up a constraint, they're really no more than basically at its most foundation level rules, a collection of rules, right? So let's now dive even more deeper into constraints, right? And there are actually two types. In addition to the custom and the actual predefined ones, we actually do have two types of very distinct constraints, right? So the first is a list, right? And typically what this would be, it would be a list of items that are basically allowed or denied, right? And this list is evaluated and it contains values, basically, right? So and basically you just go down the list and you evaluate those list items, right? The other kind of like type of constraint is a Boolean, right? A Boolean expression, right? So similar to a true false concept, and it is either enforced or non enforced, and it's very explicit in terms of the action, right? So either a condition is set for true or it isn't, or is false. So an example here, a constraint may be deploy a VM inside a specific region within GCP. So either that's going to be true or it's going to be false, right? So that's a very straightforward scenario, right? So finally, we're going to come across the concept of so in this slide, I want to talk about kind of like inherent, right? So when we look at organization policies, right, there is this concept called inherent, right? So again, going back to that prerequisite slide of the resource hierarchy, if we look at top-down structure, the organization, the actual projects, folders, and the resources, that is a top-down. And if we were to basically say we want to place a policy at the top of the hierarchy, at the organization level or at the folder level, then what's going to happen is the subsequent components underneath the bottom components simply inherits the policy, right? So this allows us to have an organization policy that trickles down an organization and across the company, right? So if you want to have it go across the entire company, then obviously you're going to put it at the top of the resource hierarchy, at the top, at the org level, right? If you wanted to apply at a specific project or say a specific resource, then you apply it there, but the scope will be much more, right? So really the inheritance really focuses on the scope, right? It's going to trickle down and subcomponents are going to inherit that organization policy, right? And one of the advantages of doing this, it avoids repetitions, right? So you don't want to keep on repeating the same thing over and over again at different hierarchical places within the actual structure, the resource hierarchy, right? Now, you can apply at the root organization at the top, the root organization node, and then subsequently pass the folders, projects, service resources, right? Straightforward there, right? Everything by default inherits the policy. Now, you can create an organization policy that overwrites the inherited one. So let's say we set one at the organization node, the folders inherits it, the project inherits it, and the service resource. Then we add another one at the project level, right? At the service resource at the subcomponent, it will simply overwrite the one that's been inherited from the top down, right? Now, and this is typically when you create an organization policy, the one that overwrites at the bottom level, it is created with the organization policy administrator role, right? So that's something to keep in mind, right? So, but in addition to having it merged, so in addition to having it replaced, like a lower level organization policy, one that's been inherited, you could, in theory, merge the two policies, right? And this is based on a number of rules that you can define, right? So, so you actually have an explicit override or the ability to fuse the two together to create a merger of a new subset of the organization policy, right? And then, just briefly touching on the final concept is violations, right? So organization policies, great concept. Inheritance, great concept as well. But sometimes there can be a violation because we are looking at a number of rules here, how we inherit things, how we merge things, and things like that, right? So when we look at the most basic level, a violation is basically a constraint that Google Cloud creates, right? And it needs to create these constraints, right? So when there is a conflict between the organization policy that you as a consumer of Google Cloud has created with Google Cloud's policy, that's a violation, right? So, for example, Google Cloud made it explicitly define a constraint, a restriction. Then you'll go ahead and create an organization policy that contradicts Google Cloud's policy, right? So in that instance, basically, Google Cloud's basically saying you can't do that based on our restrictions that we have imposed, right? So that's a violation, right? And when Google Cloud enforces these constraints, right, what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent the violation, right? Prevent something you're doing wrong on the Google Cloud platform, right? Now, in the above scenario is about a new organization policy that you're creating that becomes a violation, right? So something you're not supposed to do contradicts Google Cloud. Something new your deployment, instantly Google Cloud says, hey, you cannot do that. That's a violation. You're going to get shut down, right? So it's simple as that. But what actually happens in a different scenario when there is an existing organization policy that you already been created and you've been using it for some time? So let's say you've been running it for several months, 6 months, 1 year, right? So if you've been using it and now suddenly Google is saying that you now have a violation, that may be something that's changed on the Google side of things. It's something that they may have created something. They can't simply shut you down because it's a violation, because that's going to impact you, the business, the consumer of Google Cloud, right? So in that instance, what actually happens is you're giving a manual time to be basically the ability for you to manually fix that violation, right? So it's not an automatic thing, right? So that kind of concludes to this module on organization policy. And I have included a resource link that takes you to the Google website that kind of like provides more information on organization policy. And again, it is an important aspect of the certification for those that are pursuing it. Thank you. Bye.